we turn our attention to what might be called the libertarian left, or more popularly, anarchism.
This is the same logic shared by Marx and Freud.
Functioning libertarian socialist institutions, I think they are an interesting model that I think is highly relevant.
Hello. We are not in the recording studio today.
No.
Why? Oh, it's the weekend.
It's a Sunday.
Yeah, so I sent a voice message to Paolo the other day because when I've been at work, like as in my job, not the PhD work, I have been watching this YouTuber play scary games, and it's a lot of the like rubbish scary games that has a lot of jump scares. And so every so often I'm like jumping at work, and I got into bed, closed my eyes, and in my dream it was like opening doors. I was opening loads of doors, and I opened this door and an old scary lady jumped out, and I jumped, but I jumped so much that I woke myself up. And so, yeah, I can't watch scary things. Now we know.
No, you've never been able to watch scary things. And then you're deciding to watch someone else play the games for you.
Another story that I haven't told you. So, Dan was like, oh, have you, this is my partner. He was like, did you wake up at any point last night? And I was like, no, I couldn't sleep. So I asked him to come and sit in the room and just like sit next to me so I could go to sleep. I've been very stressed. And so, as soon as he sat next to me, I was gone. Like I was asleep. Apparently, an hour later, I sat up, stared at him, and he went, hello. I was like, hi, are you okay? And then he like touched my cheek, and as soon as he did that, I face planted the pillow and went back to sleep. That has never happened before.
My partner did that to me. So, because if you're on my like personal Twitter, I've been having a little bit of issues with this like app reminding me when to take my medications and all that stuff, and that affects my sleep because if I don't have my medications, I just feel blah blah blah. So I've been waking up extremely early, like unfashionably so, and I just go on my phone, and you know, like my partner's next to me, so I'm just gonna be on my phone, put it on mute, like nothing, and suddenly wakes up and goes, hey you. And then immediately back to sleep. Does not recall a single moment. So today's subject is intersectionality.
Yeah, nothing to do.
No, this would have been good for Freud.
Yes. But yeah, welcome to Theoryish. As part of our podcast, we occasionally have episodes in which we introduce a wider idea or a concept. Unlike the rest of our episodes, these introduction twos are scripted in order to keep us on track. So I did one of these episodes in season 1 titled Introduction to Queer Theory, and Paolo did a very well received episode titled Introduction to Post-Structuralism.
Yes.
Yeah, this season. And so we highly recommend either of these if you're interested in the subject matter, or if you want an introductory source for your students, friends, family, loved ones, or yourself, you know.
Mm-hmm. You can also learn.
Yeah. So we host our podcast through Spotify, primarily because it's free. And Spotify has a feature that allows us to post polls under each episode. So if you click on the episode while you're listening and scroll down, you'll see a poll or like a question sometimes. And so last season we ran a poll on our Introduction to Queer Theory in which we asked people what they wanted this season's introductions twos to be. And in addition to post-structuralism, people wanted to hear an introduction to intersectionality, and so that's what we're going to do today. I scripted this episode for today, as I've taught this topic before and already had a reading list prepared that I send to people if they ever ask me about intersectionality. And Paolo will be reading some of the sections as well as adding any additional points. But before we begin, I want to point out that all of our episode descriptions contain a link to a Google Doc in which we list all our sources and information, so please feel free to access if you'd like to know more. None of these points are my own, they are all other people's that I have read.
Yeah, these things build up on each other. So, hey, it's a free, accessible reading list. So if you really need, especially, this would be coming out probably at the end of your academic terms. But for next term, if you need a list of things to reference, now you know. Yeah. All right. So the term intersectionality was first coined by Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw in 1989 in a paper titled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics. Crenshaw is an American scholar who focuses on civil rights, critical race theory, Black feminist legal theory, and race and racism and the law. She's a professor of law at both Columbia Law School and University of California, Los Angeles, also known as UCLA.
Yeah, so the history of the concept is extremely vast, and I'm starting with the history because it's important to note that Crenshaw sees her coining of the term as an extension and continuity to work that African American women have done for centuries. In an interview with Ben Adewunmi in 2014, Crenshaw states, quote, "In every generation and in every intellectual sphere and in every political moment, there have been African American women who have articulated the need to think and talk about race through a lens that looks at race. So this is in continuity with that," end quote. Patricia Hill Collins discusses how intersectionality is the renaming of work that Black women and women of colour and people of colour in general engage with through their work on community organising, identity politics, coalitional politics, analyses of interlocking systems of oppression and social justice. And in particular, there's been an acknowledgement by many individuals regarding these interlocking oppressions that women of colour in particular face.
A few individuals that we discussed in relation to the history of intersectional thinking include Sojourner Truth, with Crenshaw herself articulating that feminism did not learn lessons from Sojourner Truth's 1851 speech aimed at a woman, in which she challenged white patriarchal and sexist framings of womanhood. Also in the 19th century, there is Anna Julia Cooper, who wrote a collection of essays in 1892 called A Voice from the South that sought to uplift Black women and girls. Ida B. Wells Barnett advocated through her pamphlets like Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, and The Red Record for lynched Black women in the 1880s through the 1930s. W.E.B. Du Bois, who we did an episode about in Season 1, discussed the ways in which frameworks of oppression, including race, class, and nation, intersected. Stuart Hall, who Hannah and Dipuk discussed in Season 1, worked on an immigrant experience in Britain, discussing the inequalities of class, nation, race, and ethnicity. Patricia Hill Collins names quite a few people in relation to the beginnings of intersectional thinking, including European feminists like Nira Yuval Davis and Floya Anthias, who put forward similar ideas that can be viewed as, quote, intersectional knowledge projects, end quote, in hindsight. In 1984, Audre Lorde wrote a now very famous essay titled The Master's Tools Would Never Dismantle the Master's House, discussing the ways tools of oppression cannot be used for liberation and how assimilationist projects will also not lead to liberation. Gloria Anzaldua's 1987 book, Borderlands, La Frontera, discussed Chicano and Latino experiences through gender identity, race, and colonialism. Angela Davis's 1981 book, Women, Race, and Class, discussed the intertwining histories of abolitionists and women's suffrage movements articulating racial and class prejudices in white feminism. Toni Morrison, a novelist, also discusses intersecting oppressions in her book, The Bluest Eye and Beloved.
So these are just a few of the individuals that I saw mentioned in relation to the history of intersectional thinking. There's many more, and it's important to recognize that the concept intersectionality reframed and gave language to a discussion that has long been occurring amongst people of colour all around the world. So this is something that Crenshaw acknowledges herself and is something I saw continuously mentioned in the literature. So to finish this section off, I also want to point out that intersectionality emerges in the late 1980s from critical race studies, an interdisciplinary academic field that focuses on social constructions of race and ethnicity, laws, and media. Crenshaw is also considered one of the founders of critical race studies, alongside Derek Bell, Richard Delgado, and others.
Intersectionality is a term that refers to the ways in which identity categories such as race, class, gender, ethnicity, nation, ability, and age are not mutually exclusive and intersect in ways that produce complex inequalities. Inequality and discrimination compounds on a person, meaning that people, particularly marginalized individuals, are not just facing one barrier at a time, but many all at once. Crenshaw provides an excellent metaphor to visualize this on page 149 of her 1989 text. Quote, "Consider an analogy to traffic in an intersection coming and going in all four directions. Discrimination, like traffic through an intersection, may flow in one direction, and it may flow in another. If an accident happens in an intersection, it can be caused by cars traveling from any number of directions, and sometimes from all of them." Crenshaw's original 1989 text both sought to challenge legal conceptualizations of discrimination through Black feminist ideas, but also challenged the tendency in white feminism to homogenize women's experiences as all facing the same oppression, the patriarchy. Crenshaw wanted to critique the utilization of single-axis frameworks that view discrimination through race or gender, but never both. And so those who are multiply burdened, such as Black women, end up erased from analysis and unprotected. Crenshaw in 2014 stated that in drawing attention to those erasures, she draws attention to the ways which, quote, "women of color are invisible in plain sight," end quote.
So the first half of Crenshaw's essay demonstrates her points using 3 legal trials, which I think are worth providing an overview for because these very clearly articulate the legal basis for Crenshaw's argument, as well as the ways in which anti-discrimination laws were deemed to be inadequate. So the first case is De Graffenried v. General Motors, and in this case, 5 Black women brought a suit against General Motors, stating that the employer's seniority system perpetuated the effects of past discrimination against Black women. So prior to 1964, General Motors did not hire Black women, and in 1970, all of the Black women hired lost their jobs in a seniority-based layoff during a recession. Yeah, I don't know. Basically, they were like, oh, you're too low rank, so we're getting rid of you and we're saving all the senior people. But they couldn't have had those positions in the first place. So in this court case, the district judge stated that Black women are not, quote, "a special case to be protected from discrimination," end quote. They stated that because General Motors had hired white women prior to 1964, that this could not be sex-based discrimination. And the court then dismissed this as a race discrimination complaint after consolidating with another case alleging race discrimination against the same employer. So the plaintiff stated that this consolidation defeated the purpose of the suit, as this was both a race and sex discrimination claim being brought forward. This was thrown out as well, as the court did not want to risk, quote, "opening the hackneyed Pandora's box," end quote. The main takeaway from Crenshaw's discussion of this case is that under a single axis framework, Black women would only get protected as long as their experiences either coincided with white women or Black men.
Yeah, and this is where I'm going to add a bit of an American context, where court cases are used to prove other court cases. You build up upon the law. So with this being thrown out, this also sets a precedent in which it would continue this systematic oppressions, because you either have to be a white woman or a Black man to feel or to have a precedent. So once more, this is not only just a Black and white issue, but that also leads into Asian peoples, Latino people, Southeast Asians. So this is a huge thing when you can't just have a combination court case.
And the second case discussed by Crenshaw was more of a Hughes helicopter. So this is slightly more complex than the last example, but I can go into it if you need me to. It's important to understand what Crenshaw is trying to say here because it links to the second half of the essay. So in this case, the plaintiff alleged that the employer, Hughes Helicopter, practiced race and sex discrimination when promoting individuals to upper-level craft positions and supervisory jobs. The plaintiff used statistical evidence that articulated a significant disparity between men and women and a smaller disparity between black men and white men in supervisory jobs. So the district court refused to certify Moore as a class representative of all the women at Hughes in the sex discrimination complaint as, quote, Moore had never claimed before the EEOC that she was discriminated as female, but only as a black female. This raised serious doubts as to Moore's ability to adequately represent white female employees, end quote. So here, Crenshaw states that the court implies that Moore did not claim that all females were discriminated against, but only black females. Thus, the claims of racism are seen as oppositional to the claims of sexism. There's also a preference showed here, revealing, quote, the implicit grounding of white female experiences in the doctrinal conceptualization of sex discrimination, end quote. For white women to claim sex discrimination, the idea is that if they were men, there would be no other barriers to entry into these senior positions, that this discrimination against their womanhood is the issue. The racial element does not need to be said, because there's white privilege evident here. The same cannot be said for black women, because kind of Crenshaw lays out on page 151, quote, race and sex, moreover, become significant only when they operate to explicitly disadvantage the victims because the privileging of whiteness or maleness is implicit, it's generally not perceived at all, end quote. A single axis view on anti-discrimination would only deal with part of the issue for black women, thus leaving other discriminatory practices in place. As the court took this stance against Moore, she had to support her race and sex discrimination claims with statistical evidence of discrimination against black women alone, and she could not use evidence of the discrimination against white women or the evidence of discrimination against black men. The court then placed further limitations on Moore, limiting the statistical pool to only black women who were qualified, and I'd say qualified in air quotations, to fill the openings in upper-level labour jobs and in supervisory positions. As Moore could not demonstrate this, she could not prove discrimination, thus rendering the claims groundless. Essentially, there is a privileging of whiteness here. The claim is that because she is representing a black woman, that she therefore cannot represent all women. Thus, there's a recognition of the difference here, but without any bringing in that difference into this court case, right? They use that difference as a weaponized thing.
Yeah, it's also just sort of like the elephant in the room is race, and without saying it, if you don't say it, it doesn't exist.
Mm-hmm. So, in the third and final case, Payne v. Travenol, two black female plaintiffs brought a class action lawsuit on behalf of all black employees at a pharmaceutical plant on the basis of race discrimination. So, the court refused, narrowing the lawsuit to only represent black women. The court ended up finding extensive racial discrimination, awarding back pay and constructive seniority to black female employees, but refused to overturn their previous decision and extend this to the black male employees. Crenshaw states that this creates a dilemma for black women who either have to articulate their own intersecting discrimination, thus erasing their ability to represent black men, or ignoring these intersectional aspects in order to not exclude black men from their claims. So all of these cases showcase the flaws in a single axis framework, as these do not account for the ways in which black women experience the intersection of race and gender. And these experiences can overlap with white women's experiences and the experiences of black men, but they're not exactly the same and shouldn't really be treated as such.
Yeah, so Crenshaw moves on to her critique of white feminism, in which makes up the rest of the paper. She states that white feminism often essentializes the experiences of women under one homogeneous frame of analysis. Crenshaw states on page 154 that, quote, not only are women of color in fact overlooked, but their exclusion is reinforced when white women speak for and as women, end quote. Thus, this kind of analysis not only elides the individual experience of women of color, but is also actively harmful because the theoretical analysis provided by white feminism end up being, quote, overgeneralized at best and often wrong, end quote. In 2014, Crenshaw went on to say that this critique is not meant to disempower white feminism, stating, quote, "A critique of one's voice isn't taking it away if the underlying assumptions behind this category of, quote, feminine or, quote, women is that we are a coalition, then we have the coalition practice and some form of accountability," end quote. Intersectionality as a concept took off, with Leslie McCall stating in 2005 that intersectionality is, quote, "the most important theoretical contribution that women's studies, in conjunction with related fields, has made so far," end quote. This not only became a scholarly buzzword used in many different disciplines, but has also become a terminology that has entered popular discourse. Intersectionality resulted in an incredible amount of journal articles, special editions, edited volumes, and books aimed at undergraduates articulating the term. In many courses, this is a key concept introduced to students early into their undergraduate degrees. Safe to say that this concept has been incredibly popular. And I have also taught this in my lessons, using intersectionality as a tool to think about more complicated issues surrounding things like decolonization, war, and colonial presence.
Mm-hmm. It's a very useful framework, especially for undergrads, to get them to think beyond their own personal experience, or like Crenshaw is saying, this single axis framework. You're not just looking at one thing, you're also considering, say you do look at white women, for example, you're articulating that this is a thing that is looking at white women rather than just speaking homogeneously for everybody.
And into one last point before you move on, it is also a great framework to get them to think outside of their own class, especially here in the UK. With teaching at a very well-respected university, a lot of these students come from very different backgrounds. And for the first time ever, they're experiencing or seeing things outside of their own norm. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it is a very complicated thing to wrap your head around. So here, intersectionality is also a way to look at themselves and their privileges and disadvantages. And how do they situate themselves with their parents, with their political stances? It's a really complicated and, I think, integral component of undergraduate life.
A task that we get them to do in Sociology of Gender, which is not mine, it was given to me by the module convener a few years ago, is you put different pieces of paper around the room. Obviously we had to stop doing this during COVID, but it's come back a bit. You put pieces of paper around the room that say things like age, gender identity, sexuality, nation, ethnicity, race, all these kinds of things, right? Ability, all these things. And you put these around the room and you give them like a pack of stars or stickers and you say, so on the left-hand side, you put, this is the least privileged, and on the right-hand side, you put most privileged. And then you ask students to go around the room to each piece and put where they feel they are placed. And then it kind of gets them to think about how their experience, they might be very privileged in one area, very unprivileged or less privileged in another area. And it gets them to think about how their own intersectional experiences kind of exist. It's a really useful task you can do in classes to get students to think about intersectionality and their own identity and experiences.
That's really cool.
Mm-hmm. And sometimes you'll get students be like, I don't know where I'm placed. And that's also a really interesting kind of conversation starter. And it's also interesting to think about getting students to think about, okay, one person placed themselves as very privileged in this area, but actually is more complex than that. You know what I mean? Their idea of privilege is very different to another person's idea of privilege.
Yeah.
So it's great. Complicated, interesting. So Patricia Hill Collins wrote about intersectionality in 2015 and usefully articulates the ways in which this term has been utilized. So firstly, intersectional projects tend to focus on three areas. So intersectionality as a field of study and an object of investigation in and of itself, as an analytical strategy, so a framework of analysis that helps us produce new knowledge about the social world. and as a form of critical praxis. So praxis refers to the ways in which theory, lessons, or skills are enacted, embodied, realized, and applied in practice, so in everyday existence. So with intersectionality, this has typically been done in connection with social justice projects. So Collins also provides us with a useful introduction to the types of intersectional scholarship that exists. So there's scholarship that rethinks work, family, identity, media, and other core areas of academic inquiry. There's work that focuses on race, class, and gender that in order to incorporate other categories of analysis such as sexuality, nation, ethnicity, age, and ability. And there's discussions of nationalism, nation state, and national identity that are also included here. And there's also scholarship that rethinks violence through an intersectional framework and other kind of social issues. There's an emphasis on identity in some academic research that uses intersectionality to discuss identity. There's works critiquing the working of intersectionality itself, which I drew on a lot of for this episode.
Yeah.
And then there's methodological discussions.
Now that we have a good sense of what intersectionality is, we want to introduce some complexities into the conversation. Intersectionality, like all academic theory, is not perfect, and it cannot be applied perfectly, and it's important to recognize that these issues in order to develop the theory further. We draw up on two main texts for this point. First is Jennifer C. Nash's 2008 piece, Rethinking Intersectionality, and Patricia Hill Collins's 2015 piece, which has been mentioned throughout. To begin, Nash identifies 4 key tensions in intersectionality scholarship. That is that there is a lack of a defined methodology. Second, the way Black women are used as quintessential intersection subjects. Third, vague definitions. And fourth, the empirical validity.
So these are going to be really interesting, and feel free to jump in with any points.
Of course.
Because I found these really, really interesting and actually quite valid points. And I do want to also say that both Nash and Collins don't say we should stop using intersectionality, more so that we need to consider these things should we continue to use this this term. Mm-hmm. And so the first thing is methodology. So a methodology is the systems of methods used in a particular study or activity. So basically, how are you looking at investigating and analyzing something? When wanting to look at something intersectionally, how does one go about doing this? How many intersections do you look at? How do you look at a point of an intersection? What does it mean in actuality? In essence, subjectivity, embodiment, identity, marginalization, and power, these are all incredibly complex topics. And so how do we, as researchers, capture people's experiences in ways that do justice to these experiences, whilst also producing a coherent and manageable research project? So Nash suggests 3 kind of ways of going about this, but in practice, I think it is still quite complicated.
Yeah, of course.
And so there's an anti-categorical complexity. So these are research projects that essentially say categories such as gender, race, age, etc. are too simplistic. And so we should not reproduce these in our work. And you see this a lot in queer discussions of identity, claiming that everybody feels identity differently. And so it's not a legitimate framework of analysis.
Oh, 100%. It's so hard, but it's also such a complicated thing in praxis, because at the end of the day, you kind of do have to generalize, because you can't just infinitely write on individuals' experiences unless that's what you're doing exactly.
I can't remember whose research it is. I'll see if I can find it and put it in the description. But there is research that looks at straight men who engage in homosexual, not relationships, but they go have sex with gay men, other straight men, but they define themselves as straight. And so, for example, that's an issue with identity. How do you categorize that?
Yeah, and I kind of work with those things, and you should send it my way, actually. But it's these things where it's it might be temporal, it might be situational, it might be you're just exploring things, and sometimes it doesn't feel right. Yeah, so these things are really difficult to say and to state and to clarify and define. Yeah.
And so Nash also says that some research uses intra categorical complexity. So that's where you take a marginalized intersectional identity as an analytical starting point. So this is essentially what Crenshaw is doing herself when discussing Black women to articulate flaws in frameworks of anti-discrimination and white feminism. And then there's inter-categorical complexity. That is where you adopt multiple analytical categories to document inequality among social groups. Essentially, a lot of the historical examples I mentioned earlier do this. So, for example, Stuart Hall looking at migration through frameworks of race, class, and nation. The next kind of section kind of looks at how Crenshaw discusses Black women's experiences, but also, like we said earlier, or like Paula said earlier, you know, Black women are often used as quintessential intersectional subjects. So another example I can say that kind of mirrors this is when queer studies uses trans people to say, like, this is an example of non-normative existence, this is an example of, like, the most queer experience, this is an example of gender, you know what I mean?
It's tokenism.
Yeah. And so that's essentially what Nash is trying to say we avoid. Nash states that Crenshaw, through her argument of the ways in which Black women's experiences exceed a single axis framework, ends up arguing that Black women's identities become constituted exclusively through race and gender, and that this becomes a framework people use. So whilst Crenshaw makes reference to the ways in which Black women are multiply burdened, this doesn't really get expanded on beyond race and gender. She does mention class, but then doesn't really bring it in. So this framework of race and gender also becomes transhistorical, meaning that race and gender becomes essentialized categories throughout space and time, despite understandings and constructions of race and gender being influenced massively by time period and geographical location. Black women are also treated as a monolithic entity in Crenshaw's original work, without intricacies of their experiences of personhood embellished upon. And I don't know enough to say this, but I wonder if part of the issue is embedded in the legal discipline. You know what I mean?
Well, it's also the built-in class. It was also built-in class system. These women were not allowed to go beyond a specific income, and even if it was a double household income, there's still a cap. So the class is already embedded within the actual thing. Because had this maybe been published later, this wouldn't have been said about people like, for example, Michelle Obama. She's a very powerful, like, Black woman. She has a much higher income than most people in everyday life because her income is not capped. So I think this is where class is not said implicitly, but it is implied. So I think it's one of those, like, it's a technicality.
Yeah, I think that's what I mean. I think it's a technicality. I personally don't think it's what Crenshaw was trying to do. I think she was trying to get a certain point across. She gets that point across.
We are going to go into this, but this is also the complications of using intersectionality. How deep do you go?
Yeah, so Black women become the prototypical intersectional subjects whose experiences of marginality are imagined to provide a theoretical value added. So essentially, Black women's experiences become what people used to articulate examples of intersectionality, which both centers Black women's experiences, but really risks ensuring Black women's experiences are not analysed in any depth, both within and beyond an intersectional framework. So sometimes you'll get people talk about intersectionality in texts or even in modules and stuff like that, where they'll use Black women's experience as an example, but then they don't really do anything with that example. It's just kind of there to be like, oh, I know intersectionality exists.
Well, it's sort of saying the quiet part out loud, which is, this is the most disadvantaged person in the room.
Yeah. And so Black women's experiences become what Nash calls, quote, theoretical wedge that is used to point out shortcomings of conventional feminist and anti-racist work. So it's kind of like, well, your research didn't account for this and I'm better than you for, like, pointing that out. But that's not really doing justice to those experiences. Yeah.
It's also not realizing how privileged it is to just point at a Black woman and be like, look, she's not as privileged as me, or this is the bottom of the totem pole. Like, that is insane, to use someone's existence against their entire gender and race.
Yeah. And again, like, this isn't what Crenshaw intended with this research at all. And so I think this is why it's important to, again, return to that historical grounding and also how Crenshaw sees herself in this history of knowledge. So a different but relevant point that I've tried to avoid when producing this episode is that people often refer to Crenshaw as coining the term intersectionality as the beginning of all intersectional thinking. So she does coin the term, but it's not the beginning of intersectional thinking. So as can be seen from the historical background we gave earlier, this isn't really the case. This is done constantly and creates a, quote, collective ritual that legitimizes this particular origin story, end quote. Intersectionality seemingly does not seem to be of value until Crenshaw discovered it, and through the recognition of her Stanford Law Review article, Collins says potentially this term is used because it aligns more closely with, as Audre Lorde says, the master's tools in the master's house. So essentially, this concept has provided a neat academic tool for people to use without recognizing quite often the historical legacy behind this work. And Crenshaw herself has taken issue with this, claiming that intersectionality is often returned to her, quote, in forms that are often unrecognizable, end quote.
Yeah, I can imagine, because this was also used for a legal proceeding and for viewing cases that have to be black and white, and her entire point is like, no, there's a gray. And once more, this was a journal article. You have a limited number of words you can actually provide without the editor just choking you to death.
Metaphorically,
but I'm sure there's an editor out there just waiting. But the point of this is that it sort of grew beyond her. And that is a good thing. But I think that the quote of, like, it comes back to her unrecognizably, I don't think it's a bad thing, but it's the way that she's sort of just been tied and kind of sewn into intersectionality, when probably this is a large part of her, like, corpus, but it is not everything. Once more, we're accidentally categorizing her in a specific thing, almost like we're not acknowledging intersectionality.
Yeah. And so another issue kind of connected to this is the issue of defining intersectionality. So throughout this podcast, we've sought to define intersectionality for you, but in actuality, there is many different conceptualizations of intersectionality, as scholars and practitioners produce a variety of work in many different disciplinary and interdisciplinary ways.
Once more, an accidental theme of the season.
Yeah. And so, as Collins says, many scholars and practitioners, quote, think they know intersectionality when they see it, end quote. And this really isn't the best basis for an extension of analysis.
It's shady.
A lot of people are like, yeah, I know this is intersectional, or I know, like, I don't know, I don't know if I'll keep this in, but I remember on Twitter a while ago, somebody said they were reading a good intersectional book, and I was like, okay, but what do you mean? Like, what do you mean by that?
It's like, right now we're recording in June, so that new season of Bridgerton came out, and people are like, this is intersectionality come to the screen. And I'm just like, what do you mean, sis? Because even though there's different shaped bodies, there's different races, all these are, like, upper crusts people that are, like, friends with a queen. Like, come on.
Yeah.
What are you intersecting? Like... two Louis Vuitton bags? Like...
Yeah. So Collins further iterates based on Edward Said's discussion of theory that theories can lose their, quote, originality and critical stance as they travel from one domain to another, end quote, and potentially the same can be said for intersectionality. Whilst Collins refers to this more so in the academic sphere and sphere of practitioners, intersectionality is also becoming more popular terminology in general discourse, potentially diluting its critical potential and original meaning. So, for example, like you were saying, I sometimes see intersectional being used as a way to indicate diversity rather than, like, intersecting kind of domains oppression that impacts upon individuals.
And it's also, I think there's a huge focus on race when it comes to intersectionality, and like rightly so. However, there are places and stances where race is not even part of the intersectional argument. It's mostly focused on state power, who has that power, and sometimes that doesn't involve race, but like money, nationality, parental privileges, things that are a lot more complicated and a lot more diverse in a way that it's not just black, white, Asian, all these things, but what might be the hegemonic differentiation between peoples, which is only defined by the individuals themselves.
And so, leading very nicely onto my next point, who is intersectional? So this is a
Almost as if I knew where we were going.
So this is a big issue and something that I discuss with my students quite often. Essentially, Crenshaw's argument particularly emphasizes the past erasure of academic and legal discussions of black women's experiences. Thus, there is a debate over whether this theory can be used to analyse the experiences of other multiply marginalised individuals, or even those who are considered not marginalised at all. So some scholars have utilised this theory in relation to other marginalised individuals. For example, I really love an article by Momin Rahman titled Queer as Intersectionality, Theorising Gay Muslim Identities. Incredible article. However, some feminist scholars state that intersectionality refers to all subject positions. For example, if you take a straight white man, they have intersecting subject positions of sexuality, race, and masculinity, even though these are not marginalized positions necessarily. Mm-hmm. I think it is important to note that Crenshaw's theory is one that particularly focuses on marginalization, and personally, I think to move the theory away from that, especially in an insensitive or poorly done analysis, might risk detaching the theory from its historical roots and point of origin, resulting in a co-option. Yeah.
And I think that's the biggest problem with, like, I think it's one of the larger problems with specifically a specific type of white feminism, because it's saying this is a white man who is straight and who's able-bodied, maybe not taking into consideration if they were born poor, if their family has a lot of issues with alcohol or something like that, whether or not they had like a double household income. So it's sort of it's a really complicated thing to use intersectionality, and it's something that I find myself not really using, especially within my own studies, because I mostly focus on perpetrators and actors of violence. But there are issues within some of these people's lives. Either they were forced onto military stuff, or because they were poor, they had to enlist in order to have some form of income. So where does intersectionality then land? And it's a really complicated thing. And obviously, I'm not the person to answer it. But it's something to sort of have in the back of your head, how like these words become quip and become these little like talking points. And especially now that the UK is heading towards an election, the US is also heading towards an election, these words such as intersectionality can be co-opted for these like large political slogans, and they mean nothing of what they're talking about because it is just a nice sounding thing to have in the background.
And so intersectionality is an incredibly useful and interesting concept, but we need to be careful about how it's then utilized both within and outside of the academic sphere. The historical legacy of this concept is extremely important to be aware of and to acknowledge when relevant. Crenshaw coined intersectionality, but intersectional thinking has a long legacy of thinking from Black women and people of colour. And so, yeah, I hope that's the end of the script.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to end this, because at the end of the day, this was originally a concept attached to Black women getting equal pay and being able to move on within their job ladder. So as useful as this is as a tool to have in your back pocket, it's sort of, when you overdo it, you kind of lose sight of what it's meant to do and what it's advocating for, because this is an advocative term.
This is incredibly, like, I think for Crenshaw, I can't speak for Crenshaw, but from what I saw from interviews, this is a very political project, it's a very personal project, it's a very, like, it's something that is, you know, attached to his histories, attached to Crenshaw, or attached to activist fights and analyses that are particularly pointing out frameworks of marginalization, discrimination, all this kind of stuff. So, yeah. Yeah, I hope you enjoyed. I hope this was interesting for you.
I hope this was educational.
Yeah.
Yes, and with that, I think we have to say goodbye.
Thank you so much for listening to Theoryish. We really appreciate it and would love to hear your thoughts. Check out our Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Twitter at Theoryish_pod for up-to-date information, and please rate, follow, and leave a review wherever you're listening to the podcast.
If you're interested in finding anything we have mentioned in the episode, please check our show notes or description to find more details. You can also contact us at theoryishpodcast@gmail.com.
See you next time.
Goodbye.